I woke up as an empress on the morning the court had already decided to discard her. I want to be precise about the timing, because the timing is the entire shape of this story. I did not wake up at the beginning of a marriage, or the beginning of a reign, or even the beginning of a scandal. I woke up at the end of 3 weeks. I would learn within the hour, before a formal council was scheduled to recommend my removal from the throne, in favor of a woman the emperor had not stopped looking at in over a year. I lay in an enormous bed, in a room built for someone the empire had already stopped believing in, and listened to my own ladies-in-waiting discuss, in careful whispers just outside the door, whether I would be sent to the northern temple or simply quietly retired to my family's estate. They did not yet know I was listening. They did not yet know, in fact, that the woman behind that door was not quite the one they had served for the past 4 years, that she had died in a different world entirely, in a hospital bed, of an illness with a name and a treatment plan and absolutely no relevance whatsoever to anything happening in this one, and had woken up, instead, here, in a body that belonged to someone named Empress Ren, 3 weeks before her own quiet, dignified erasure. I lay very still, and listened to the whispers, and thought, not if I have anything to say about it. Then I thought, more carefully, about what I actually wanted to say. This is that story. I learned more about my own situation, in the first hour of this life, from servants who believed I was still asleep than I would have learned from a week of direct conversation with anyone who thought I was listening. The council meets in 3 weeks, one lady-in-waiting murmured, just outside the door, her voice pitched low but not quite low enough. Lord Haldan's already drafting the petition. They'll cite the lack of an heir, mostly, it's the cleanest reason, the one nobody has to actually argue about. And Lady Wren just lets it happen? The second voice asked, younger, more uncertain. She doesn't fight any of it? What would she fight with? The first voice said, not unkindly, but with the particular flatness of someone stating an obvious fact. She's never once asked to see the treasury reports. She barely knows which officials manage which provinces. The emperor stopped visiting her chambers over a year ago, and she never said a single word about it to anyone, not even to us. I don't think she has anything left to fight with, honestly. I think she's already decided this is simply what happens to her. I lay in that enormous bed and absorbed every word of it, the way you absorb a diagnosis delivered by someone who doesn't yet know you're in the room. She's never once asked to see the treasury reports. I filed that detail away with particular care, because it told me something the rest of the conversation only confirmed, whatever Empress Ren had been, in the 4 years before I arrived in her body, she had been someone content to let the actual mechanics of her position run entirely without her, while she occupied the ceremonial shape of the role and let everyone else manage the substance of it. I did not yet know enough about this world to judge her for that. I understood, even in those first disoriented minutes, that there were 100 reasons a young woman placed into an arranged imperial marriage might choose disengagement as a survival strategy, and I understood, too, that whatever those reasons had been, they were no longer going to serve the woman currently occupying this body. I sat up. The 2 ladies in waiting, hearing the movement, went immediately silent, and a moment later the door opened with the careful, practiced composure of servants who had perfected the art of appearing as though they had said nothing at all. Your Majesty, the older one said, bowing. We didn't realize you were awake. I gathered that, I said. What is your name? She looked startled, a small, quickly suppressed flicker, the look of someone being asked a question the Empress had apparently never bothered to ask in 4 years. Hannah, Your Majesty. Hannah, I said, I would like the treasury reports brought to me. All of them, going back as far as the records exist. It took until late afternoon for the reports to arrive, not because Hannah was slow, I would learn, but because the request itself was so unprecedented that several officials along the chain of approval had needed to confirm, more than once, that the Empress had actually asked for this and not simply been misquoted. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night reading. I want to explain what I found, because I think the scale of it surprised even me, and I had arrived already expecting some version of mismanagement. The treasury attached to the Empress's household, a separate fund, I learned, from the Empire's general treasury, intended to cover the costs of the Empress's own staff, charitable patronage, and the various ceremonial obligations that came with the position, had been, over 4 years, quietly and thoroughly drained. Not through any single dramatic theft. Through dozens of small, individually unremarkable decisions, contracts awarded, year after year, to suppliers who charged noticeably more than market rate, with the difference disappearing into accounts I could not immediately trace. Staff positions paid for that, cross-referencing actual palace records, did not appear to be filled by any real person. charitable disbursements recorded as sent to temples and provinces that, when I checked the dates against known temple records, had received considerably less than what the ledger claimed. It had the unmistakable shape of theft designed by someone who understood, intimately, that the Empress whose name was on these accounts would never look closely enough to notice. I found, near midnight, the detail that mattered most: a significant portion of the missing funds traced, through several careful layers of misdirection, to accounts associated with the Halden family, the same Lord Halden, I now understood from Hannah's earlier whisper, who was drafting the petition for my removal. I sat with that for a long time, in the quiet of my own chambers, with 4 years of carefully obscured theft laid out in front of me. Lord Halden was not simply engineering my political downfall. He had spent years quietly stealing from the very treasury attached to my position, confident, correctly, until that morning, that the Empress would never look closely enough to notice, and that even if she eventually did, she would have neither the standing nor the evidence to do anything meaningful about it before the council meeting made the entire question irrelevant. I thought about the 3 weeks remaining before that meeting. I thought, that's enough time, if I'm careful. It was searching for the treasury records that led me, almost by accident, to a small locked drawer in the Empress's private writing desk. A drawer Hannah, when I asked about it the next morning, seemed genuinely surprised to learn existed at all. "I don't believe anyone has opened that in years, Your Majesty," she said, producing a key from an old box of household effects that had clearly not been disturbed in some time. Empress Ren kept very little that was truly private. I assumed there was nothing of significance inside. There was a small collection of letters, never sent, addressed to no one in particular, the same instinct, I recognized with a small ache of recognition, that had led me, in another life entirely, to keep a private journal no one else ever read. The handwriting was careful, controlled, the handwriting of someone who had learned, early and thoroughly, that her private thoughts were not safe to share even with the people closest to her. "I do not think Aldrich dislikes me," one letter read, dated almost 3 years earlier. "I think he simply does not see me, in the way a person stops noticing furniture they pass every day. I have stopped trying to be noticed. I think it is easier, somehow, to disappear on my own terms than to keep failing to be seen on his." Another, dated more recently, just months before my arrival. I asked Hannah today whether she thought I should take a more active role in managing the household accounts. She seemed surprised by the question. "I think, if I am honest, I am afraid of what I might find if I looked closely at anything in this position. It feels safer not to know." I sat with that letter for a long time. I understood, reading it, something that the whispered conversation outside my door had only gestured toward. Empress Ren had not been careless, exactly, or foolish, in the way the court's quiet dismissal of her implied. She had been afraid, specifically, understandably afraid, of a position that had never once made her feel competent or valued, in a marriage that had quietly taught her, year after year, that her attention and effort were not particularly wanted. Disengagement, for her, had not been laziness. It had been the only form of self-protection available to a woman with no other tools to defend herself. I did not know what had happened to her, whether some part of her consciousness still existed somewhere, displaced by my arrival, or whether I had simply continued a story she had already, in her own quiet way, stopped trying to finish. I would never know, but reading her careful, frightened letters, I felt something that was not quite grief and not quite kinship, but adjacent to both. A fierce, protective determination that whatever happened next, in the weeks remaining before the council's vote, it would not happen because a woman in this position had simply been too afraid to look closely at her own life. I was not afraid, the way she had been. I had arrived already carrying a different kind of fear. The fear of dying once, completely, with nothing left to lose by the time I woke up here, and that particular fear, it turned out, was its own strange gift. It left very little room for the smaller, more ordinary fears that had kept Empress Ren quiet and disengaged for 4 long years. I put the letters back in the drawer, carefully, when I finished reading them. I did not destroy them. I thought, even then, that someone should remember the woman who had occupied this body before me, frightened and overlooked and quietly giving up, long before anyone in the palace had the decency to notice what they were watching happen. I met Lady Saren, the Emperor's favorite, the woman the court had already quietly decided would replace me, on the 4th day, at a garden gathering I had not initially planned to attend, until I understood that not attending would itself become a piece of evidence in the case already being built against me. She was lovely, in the specific cultivated way the court seemed to reward, graceful, soft-spoken, with the kind of warmth that filled a room without ever appearing to try. I watched her move through the gathering, watched the emperor's attention follow her without him seeming to notice he was doing it, and understood, within minutes, that whatever the original Empress Ren had felt about this woman, it had not been strategic interest. I felt something different, watching her. Not jealousy, exactly, I want to be honest about that, because I think jealousy would have clouded what I actually needed to notice. What I felt was a kind of professional curiosity, the specific attention you pay to someone whose rise is about to directly benefit from your fall, regardless of how either of you personally feels about the other. Lady Saren approached me herself, partway through the afternoon, a bold move, by court standards, though delivered with enough careful warmth that no one watching could have called it anything but gracious. Your Majesty, she said, bowing precisely the correct amount. I hope you're well. I know these past weeks must be difficult. You're very kind to ask, I said. Tell me, has Lord Halden been a particular supporter of yours, at court? I understand he's been quite active lately. Something flickered across her face, brief, controlled, but real. Lord Halden has been generous with his counsel, she said, carefully. I don't involve myself in the political mechanics of it. I try to stay above that sort of thing. It was a practiced answer. I recognized the shape of it immediately, the careful innocence of someone who had been coached, deliberately, to remain visibly untainted by the machinery operating on her behalf, so that whatever happened to the current Empress could never be laid, even partially, at her own feet. I did not think Lady Saren was cruel, watching her that afternoon. I think, if anything, she was being used in a way that mirrored my own situation more than either of us would have been comfortable admitting. A woman whose rise had been engineered by men with their own reasons, dressed up afterward as romance. But I understood, walking away from that conversation, that her innocence, real or performed, did not change what was coming, or who stood to benefit most from it. I met Emperor Aldrich properly on the 7th day, not by chance, but because I requested an audience, a request that, Hannah informed me with poorly hidden surprise, the Empress had not made of her own accord in well over a year. He received me in his private study rather than a formal hall, which I understood, even without being told directly, was itself a small mercy, the kind of gesture a man extends to someone he no longer loves but has not yet entirely stopped respecting. Ren, he said, when I entered. Not unkind, simply tired, in the specific way of a man who had been carrying a difficult decision for longer than he wanted anyone to know. I wasn't expecting you to request an audience. I wanted to discuss the treasury, I said. He looked, genuinely, surprised. The treasury. I've been reviewing the household accounts, I said. I believe a significant portion of the funds attached to my position have been misappropriated, over a period of several years, by individuals connected to Lord Halden's family. I watched something shift in his face, not disbelief, exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man encountering a version of his wife he had not previously believed existed. That's a serious accusation, he said, carefully. It is, I agreed. I'm not asking you to act on it immediately, or to take my word without verification. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know the actual condition of the treasury before the council meets in 3 weeks, regardless of what the council ultimately decides about my position. He was quiet for a long moment. Why are you telling me this, he said, finally, rather than simply letting the council proceed and leaving the treasury's condition for whoever replaces you to eventually discover? It was a fair question, and I considered my answer carefully, because I understood that whatever I said next was going to shape how he interpreted everything that followed. Because I'm not interested in revenge against a man who's tired of a marriage that wasn't built around either of our actual wishes to begin with, I said. I think you and I were placed together for reasons that had very little to do with either of us, 4 years ago, and I think we've both spent those 4 years quietly accepting an arrangement neither of us chose. I don't think exposing corruption to punish you, or to embarrass Lord Halden, is actually what I want out of the time I have left in this position. I think what I want is for the Empire's resources to be managed honestly, regardless of who's sitting on the throne when that happens. That part doesn't change, whether or not the council votes to remove me. Aldrich studied me for a long moment, and I watched him try, visibly, to reconcile this conversation with whatever expectation he had carried into the room. You've changed, he said, finally. Quietly. Perhaps, I said, or perhaps I simply stopped accepting that disengagement was the safest way to survive this position. Either way, I'd ask you to have your own people verify what I've found, independently. I don't need you to trust me. I'd just like the truth to matter, regardless of what happens to me personally once it's known. I want to be honest about the version of this story I considered, in the days after that conversation with Aldrich, and chose not to pursue. I could have fought. I had, by the second week, Enough evidence of Lord Haldan's theft to make a serious case, not just to Aldrich, but publicly, in a way that might have discredited the very council members preparing to vote for my removal. I could have positioned the corruption as proof that the people engineering my downfall were themselves corrupt, unfit to be trusted with the judgment they were about to exercise. I could have fought to keep the throne, using exactly the kind of strategic competence the original Empress Ren had apparently never bothered to develop. I thought about it seriously, for several days. And then I thought about what staying would actually mean, even if I won. I would remain married to a man who did not love me, in a position that required me to spend the rest of my life managing court intrigue I had not asked for, defending a throne I had only just discovered I was capable of defending, surrounded by a nobility that would now know, with absolute certainty, exactly how dangerous I could become if provoked. It was not, I realized, turning the question over carefully in the quiet of my own chambers, a victory I actually wanted. What I wanted was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with keeping a throne I had inherited by accident of waking up in the wrong body at the wrong moment, and everything to do with making sure that whatever happened to me next, it happened on terms I had chosen, rather than terms the court had decided for me. I thought about Lord Haldan's stolen funds, sitting in carefully laundered accounts, confident no one would ever trace them. I thought about the 3 weeks remaining before the council meeting. I thought about exactly what a woman with detailed financial records, real evidence of fraud, and absolutely nothing left to lose could accomplish, quietly, if she stopped trying to protect a position she had already decided not to keep. I sent for Hannah that evening. I need your discretion, I said, and I need you to help me understand exactly how money moves through this palace when no one in power is paying attention to it. Hannah looked at me for a long moment, the same look I'd seen from her on the first morning, the look of someone realizing the Empress she thought she knew had quietly become someone else entirely. Before I could begin the careful work of securing what remained of the treasury, I needed to understand exactly who else, beyond Hannah, might be trusted with pieces of what I was attempting, because I understood, from the very first days of this borrowed life, that a plan built entirely alone, with no verification beyond my own judgment, was a fragile thing in a court built on alliances I did not yet fully understand. The first person I approached, carefully, was Minister Aldous Cray, an elderly treasury official who had served 3 emperors before Aldrich, and who, I learned from Hannah, had a reputation for scrupulous honesty that had, over the years, cost him several promotions he might otherwise have received. Men who refused to look away from inconvenient numbers, I was beginning to understand, rarely rise as quickly as men who learn not to look at all. Minister Cray, I said, when he arrived for what he believed was a routine audience, I'd like to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer reflects poorly on people more powerful than either of us. He looked at me with the particular careful neutrality of a man who had survived decades of court politics by giving away nothing prematurely. Your Majesty may ask anything. Have you ever suspected irregularities in the household treasury accounts? I asked, specifically in contracts awarded to suppliers connected to Lord Haldan's family? Something shifted behind his eyes, not surprise, I realized. Recognition. I have noticed certain patterns, he said, carefully, that I lacked the standing to formally challenge. An Empress's household accounts fall under a different oversight structure than the general treasury. I am not authorized to audit them directly, and previous inquiries I made, informally, were discouraged. Discouraged by whom? By people whose discouragement I judged it wiser not to test further, he said, with the particular dryness of a man who had learned exactly how far his honesty could safely extend. I'd like to test it now, I said. Quietly. With your help, if you're willing, and with full understanding that I cannot promise you protection if this becomes more visible than either of us intends. Minister Cray was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an attention that felt, for the first time since I had woken into this life, like being genuinely seen rather than simply observed. 4 years ago, he said, finally, I would not have expected this conversation from you, Your Majesty. I mean that as an observation, not an insult. I understand, I said. I'm not entirely sure I would have expected it either, 4 years ago. But I'm asking now, will you help? Yes, he said, simply. I should have pushed harder, years ago, when I first noticed the pattern. I let my own caution outweigh what I knew to be true. I'd like the chance to do better, even this late, even for an empress who may not occupy this position much longer. It was Minister Cray, in the end, who quietly verified the legitimacy of the obscure charitable trust clause Hannah had found, confirming, through channels I could never have accessed alone, that the structure was not only legal but entirely unchallengeable under existing law, precisely because no one currently in power had thought to update or close it in over a century. With his verification in hand, the plan stopped being a fragile, solitary gamble, and became something far steadier. A quiet, carefully built alliance between three people the court had spent years training itself not to take seriously: a disengaged empress, an overlooked lady-in-waiting, and an honest old minister who had simply been waiting, it turned out, for someone to finally ask him the right question. The next 2 weeks were the most carefully invisible work I have ever done in either of my lives. I did not confront Lord Haldan directly. I did not announce my findings to the court, or attempt to rally allies among the nobility, or do anything that might suggest, to anyone watching, that the Empress had suddenly become a political threat worth taking seriously before the council meeting. I wanted, very specifically, for everyone preparing to discard me to continue believing they were dealing with exactly the disengaged, harmless woman they had always assumed Empress Ren to be. What I did instead, with Hannah's careful help, was build a complete, independently verifiable account of where the stolen treasury funds had actually gone. Not to expose it publicly, but to trace it back to its source with enough precision that I could, quietly, begin redirecting a portion of what remained before anyone realized the audit had ever happened. It was delicate work. Hannah, it turned out, had a sharper understanding of palace financial mechanics than anyone had ever bothered to ask her about. 4 years of quietly observing the household's affairs from the position of someone never expected to have an opinion about them. The same position, I understood with a particular sympathy, that the original Empress Ren had occupied at the top of the same hierarchy. There's a clause, Hannah told me, on the 9th day, looking through an old household charter she had found buried in an archive no one had consulted in years, that allows the Empress to establish independent charitable trusts, funded from her personal household treasury, without requiring council approval. It's old, from before the council had the kind of oversight powers it has now. I don't think anyone currently at court even remembers it exists. I read the clause 3 times. Could that trust, I asked carefully, hold funds that aren't easily traceable back to the Empress's official accounts, once they're transferred into it? I believe so, Your Majesty, Hannah said. I believe that's rather the entire point of how it was originally written. I established 4 such trusts over the following week, each one modest enough on paper not to attract immediate attention, each one technically legitimate under a charter clause so obscure that even Lord Haldan's people, who I now understood had been monitoring the treasury accounts closely enough to manage their own theft, had apparently never thought to check for it. Into those trusts, over the final 2 weeks before the council meeting, I moved every recoverable fragment of the household treasury that Lord Haldan's theft had not already permanently consumed. Not stealing, I want to be clear about that distinction, because it mattered enormously to how I thought about what I was doing. Simply securing, under legitimate legal structure, resources that were mine to direct as Empress, before a council vote could place those same resources under the control of whoever came next. The council meeting, when it finally arrived, unfolded almost exactly as the whispered conversation outside my door had predicted, 3 weeks earlier, though I do not think anyone in that chamber understood, watching it happen, how completely the actual stakes had shifted beneath the surface of the proceedings. Lord Haldan presented his petition with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who believed the outcome had been settled long before the formal vote. He cited the lack of an heir, the Empress's documented disengagement from court affairs, the Emperor's evident personal preference for a different companion, careful, bloodless language, designed to make the removal feel like simple administrative housekeeping rather than the cruelty it actually was. I did not contest it. I want to describe what that looked like, because I think the choice not to fight, in that specific moment, surprised everyone in the chamber more than a passionate defense would have. I sat, composed, and listened to the case for my own removal, and when the council chair asked, as formal procedure required, whether the Empress wished to respond, I said simply, I have no objection to the council's proceedings. The silence that followed was its own kind of statement. Aldrich, seated at the head of the chamber, looked at me for a long moment, and I understood, watching his face, that he had expected something else. Not necessarily a fight, but something. Some sign of the woman who had come to his study weeks earlier with evidence of treasury fraud, some indication that the conversation between us had meant anything beyond a single strange afternoon. I gave him nothing, in that chamber. I want to be honest about why. I had already told him everything that mattered, privately, in the only conversation I actually owed him. What happened in the council chamber that day was a formality, a piece of political theater that had been decided long before either of us had any real say in it, and I was not interested in performing distress for an audience that had already cast its vote in every meaningful sense. The council voted, predictably, in favor of my removal. The formal language cited mutual recognition that the marriage no longer served the empire's interests, the careful, bloodless phrasing of men protecting their own comfort, rather than describing anything that had actually happened. I was to be relocated to my family's provincial estate within the month, with a modest allowance befitting a former empress's dignity, and no further claim on the imperial treasury. I accepted the terms without complaint. I had already moved everything I needed. It was 3 days after the council's ruling that Lord Halden discovered the actual condition of the treasury he had spent 4 years quietly draining, not because I told him, but because his own people, finally checking the household accounts now that the Empress's removal had been formally settled, found considerably less remaining than they had expected. I learned about his reaction secondhand, through Hannah, who still maintained careful contact with the household staff even after my own departure had been formally arranged. "He's furious," Hannah told me, the evening before I was scheduled to leave for the provincial estate. "He's accusing the treasury clerks of incompetence. He doesn't understand where the discrepancy came from. The official records show the funds existing in various charitable trusts, all technically legitimate, all established under your authority as Empress before your removal." "And does anyone suspect it was deliberate?" I asked. "A few," Hannah admitted. "But no one can prove it was anything other than an Empress making use of her legal authority, in the final weeks of her position, exactly as that authority was always designed to permit. There's nothing to challenge, legally. The clause is old, but it's real." I thought about Lord Halden, discovering, 3 days too late, that the treasury he had spent 4 years quietly stealing from had been, in its final weeks, far better defended than he had ever imagined the Empress capable of managing. I did not feel triumphant exactly, hearing it. What I felt was something quieter, the specific satisfaction of watching a man who had built an entire scheme around the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to stop him, discover, finally, that someone had been looking the entire time. "And Lady Saren?" I asked. "How is she settling into the position?" "Uncertain," Hannah said. "I think she expected the transition to feel more like a victory than it apparently does. The treasury she's inherited is considerably emptier than the one everyone assumed she was stepping into. I think she's beginning to understand that Lord Halden's support came with conditions she didn't fully appreciate until now." I nodded, and didn't ask anything further. Lady Saren's situation, whatever it became, was no longer mine to manage or worry over. I had spent 4 years, 3 of them not even my own, inside a position built around managing other people's expectations of me. I was finished with that particular work. The morning of my departure, Aldrich came to see me off himself, a gesture, Hannah told me quietly, that surprised the household staff considerably, since former empresses were typically sent away with nothing more than a formal escort and a brief, distant farewell from whichever official happened to be assigned the duty. He found me in the courtyard, beside the modest carriage that would carry me to my family's provincial estate, and for a long moment he simply looked at me, the way he had in his study weeks earlier, as though still trying to reconcile 2 different versions of the same woman. "I had Minister Cray review the final treasury accounts," he said, finally. "Thoroughly, this time, with real authority behind the request." "And what did he find?" "Exactly what you told me he would," Aldrich said. "Lord Halden's theft, going back years. Considerably less remaining than the official records suggested, though the explanation for that particular discrepancy seems to be entirely legal, however inconvenient it's proven for certain people at court." "I'm glad the audit found what it found," I said. "Regardless of the timing." "Wren," he said, and something in his voice had changed, become less careful, more genuinely uncertain. "Why didn't you fight the council's decision? You had the evidence. You could have used it to discredit Halden publicly, turned the entire vote against him instead of yourself. I don't think anyone in that chamber would have stopped you." I considered the question honestly, because I thought he deserved an honest answer, even this late, even with a carriage waiting to carry me away from a life that had never quite fit either of us. "Because winning that fight would have meant staying," I said. "And I'm not sure either of us actually wanted that, underneath everything. I think you found something with Lady Saren that you never found with me, and I don't think that's a tragedy, exactly, I think it's simply true, and true things don't always need to be punished. I didn't want to win a marriage neither of us chose. I wanted to leave it on terms that didn't require me to beg for a place I'd already decided wasn't where I belonged." He was quiet for a long moment. "What will you do?" he asked, "at the estate?" "Something of my own," I said. "I'm not entirely certain what, yet." But I have resources now that no one expected me to have, and considerably more clarity about what I actually want than I had 4 weeks ago. I think that's enough to start with. He nodded, slowly, and for a moment looked almost like he wanted to say something else. An apology, perhaps, or some acknowledgement of the 4 quietly wasted years behind us. But he didn't, in the end, and I understood that some things were better left unsaid between 2 people whose paths were about to diverge as completely as ours were. "Travel safely, Ren," he said, finally. "Thank you, Aldrich," I said. "I hope you and Lady Saren find what you're actually looking for." "I mean that sincerely." I climbed into the carriage. Hannah climbed in beside me. She had asked, 2 days earlier, with a directness that had surprised me, whether she might continue in my service at the estate rather than remain in a palace household that would soon belong to someone else. Entirely, and I had said yes before she'd even finished the question. The carriage pulled away from the palace gates, and I did not look back. It has been a year. The provincial estate I was sent to with a modest allowance befitting a former empress's dignity turned out to be considerably more valuable, once properly managed, than the council had likely intended when they drafted that careful, dismissive phrase. The land includes several profitable vineyards that had been quietly mismanaged by absentee stewards for years, the same kind of slow, unexamined drain I had learned to recognize in the palace treasury, and Minister Cray, who resigned his palace position 3 months after my departure, for reasons of conscience, as he put it, with a small dry smile when he told me, now manages the estate's accounts with the same scrupulous honesty that had cost him so much at court, and serves him so well here instead. The 4 charitable trusts I established in my final weeks as Empress have become, over the past year, something considerably larger than their original modest purpose, a network of genuine provincial investment, funding schools and granaries and small infrastructure projects in regions the imperial treasury had long since stopped paying proper attention to. I did not plan, when I first read that obscure century-old charter clause, to build anything resembling a second career out of redirecting stolen wealth into honest use. But it turns out, I am, much like the version of myself I left behind in another world entirely, someone who finds genuine satisfaction in building things properly, once given the chance. I hear from the palace occasionally, through the careful, slow channels that connect a provincial estate to the capital. Lord Halden was formally stripped of his council seat 8 months ago, once Minister Cray's thorough audit made the scale of his theft impossible to quietly overlook any longer, not through any scheme of mine, I should say clearly, but through the simple, patient mechanism of an honest man finally being given the authority to look closely at numbers he had wanted to examine for years. Lady Saren, I'm told, has settled into the role with more grace than the circumstances of her rise might have suggested she'd manage, though I hear, too, that she has spent considerable effort distancing herself, publicly and often, from the Halden family's influence, the same family whose support had once seemed essential to her position and now, apparently, threatens to define her by association with a scandal she had no real part in creating. I understand that particular weight better than almost anyone currently at court, and I find I do not begrudge her the difficulty of carrying it. Aldrich and I exchange brief, formal letters twice a year, nothing warm, nothing that pretends at a closeness neither of us actually feels, but something steadier than bitterness, the careful correspondence of 2 people who once shared a difficult chapter and have both, separately, found their way to something better since. Hannah runs my household here with the same quiet competence she once offered a palace that never properly valued it. She married, this spring, a steward from the neighboring estate, and I stood beside her at the small ceremony, and felt, watching her, something close to the satisfaction I imagine the original Empress Ren might have felt, somewhere, if any part of her consciousness had remained to witness what became of the body and position she'd quietly stopped fighting for, years before I ever arrived to finish the job she'd started without meaning to. I still don't know why I woke up in her life, on that particular morning, 3 weeks before her own carefully arranged erasure. I've stopped expecting the question to ever resolve itself. Some transitions, I've come to understand, simply happen, without explanation, and the only honest response available is to build something worth the strange, unearned gift of a second chance, rather than spend the rest of your days demanding to understand why it was given to you at all. I am not an empress anymore. I want to be clear that I do not mourn that fact, not even slightly. I am something else now, something I built myself, on terms I chose, with resources no one expected me to have and a clarity no one expected me to develop. It is, I think, a considerably better position than the one the council voted, with such careful bloodless language, to take away from me. They thought they were discarding me. I had already decided, long before their vote, exactly what I was keeping.